Now, welcome to the lecture on one of the topics that I find most interesting and most important in psychology, on false memories in clinical psychology and trauma memory. So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about repressed memories and recovered memories, and then linking that into possible connections to false memories. We're also going to be talking about how trauma is remembered. So the readings for this week include the primary reading, which is by Richard McNally, his 2005 paper Debunking Myths About Trauma and Memory. Now, this is a shorter version of his full book, which was called Remembering Trauma, which was published in 2003, which is a seminal work in skepticism about the idea of repressed memories and recovered memories. It's a very much recommended read, both the book and the shorter article. I don't expect you to have time to read the book, so I'm just assigning the article here, because it's focused on reviewing evidence. So it doesn't spend too much time talking about anecdotes. It gets straight into reviewing evidence, which I think is important for this week's reading. Now, there are other seminal papers on this topic, such as Elizabeth Loftus's work in 1993, 1994, and other great thinkers that debated the topic of recovered memories and false memories in the 1990s. But I didn't want to assign, in this particular week, anything too dated. I wanted to pick some articles that discuss the same topics and bring you up to date. Similarly, with the secondary recommended readings, my focus was on recent publications, such as our Patihis et al. Paper of 2014, which was all about what people's beliefs are about repressed memories and the difference between practitioners' beliefs and the beliefs of research scientists. Now, I chose this article specifically because of how the introduction will broaden your knowledge of the conflict between repressed memory theory and false memory findings, and the discussion that integrates all of those ideas together and makes suggestions for practice, as well as to bring the debate up to date to analyze whether a belief in repressed memories and dissociative amnesia still exists in the population today. If so, then it's a relevant topic. Indeed, we did find a fairly large number of individuals who expressed some level of belief in the idea that memories are repressed and that they can be recalled in therapy. And that's an important start in answering the question of whether it occurs in practice too. So, because in other words, individuals need to believe that repressed memories create psychopathology, and then you have to relive them in order to create a demand for that kind of therapy. And we followed up on that in the next paper here, the Patias and Pendergrass paper, which examined whether people, when asked, report recovering memories of repressed memories of abuse in psychotherapy, memories that they did not even know existed before psychotherapy, in the present day. And indeed, we did find that there was a certain percentage, below 10%, but nevertheless a percentage of people who are recalling memories of abuse for which they did not even know existed before therapy. So it's a potential thing that's carrying on in society now. It's not just a problem of the past. And again, I assign this article because the introduction gives you a broad understanding of the topic, which helps add to the lecture content that I give you. And the discussion also talks about the broad topic and applying these ideas to cautious practice in clinical psychology. And the final article I assigned here, led by Henry Otgar and colleagues, is also assigned to bring you fully up to date about the current state of events in beliefs about repressed memories in clinicians, the debate between some clinicians and some other psychologists over whether repressed memories are reliable or not, as well as a discussion of the similarity between definitions of dissociative amnesia and repressed memories, which brings everything up to date, because the current terminology used is dissociative amnesia, and we show that it's similar in definition to repressed memories. And in this article, Otgar and colleagues also dig into finding evidence for whether repressed memories occur in psychotherapy these days, and whether repressed memories are mentioned in legal cases as well in the present day. And indeed, they do find that it's a current controversy that needs some discussion and understanding, with their recommendations being that a cautiousness to these uncertain theories are needed. And again, I assigned this article to help flesh out the whole broad topic of recovered memories, false memories, and so on, in the same way that in this lecture we'll be covering these topics in a broad way too. So my recommendation here is to read every word of Richard McNally's article in the primary reading, and then in the secondary readings, my advice might be to read all the plain English aspects of the articles. So in the empirical articles, focus on the introduction and discussion. It'll flesh out your knowledge quite nicely. Of course, look in the methods and results to check the methodology too, if you wish. And with the Otgar article at the bottom, most of the article should be very interesting, relating memory to law and to psychotherapy too. And most of it should be written in a clear way too. Now, I think you might be interested in the fact, and very proud in the fact, that Portsmouth University has been one of the top universities in the UK when it comes to false memory research over the last few decades. And this is largely due to the interest, the hard work, and the articles by Dr. James Ost. Sadly, Dr. Ost passed away in 2019. He had an interesting history. He first became very interested in the British False Memory Society and the controversy of false memories in psychotherapy in the 1990s, while he was still an undergraduate in psychology at Portsmouth University. In fact, he was so interested in the topic that he then did a doctorate on the subject, and then became a lecturer and a researcher focusing on the topic of memory distortions and the idea of recovered memories too, and the controversy. And then he rose to the head of the department, again still at Portsmouth University. And what a great example to undergraduates he was here, showing that Portsmouth University psychology undergraduates can go on to do well and to do something that they absolutely love too. So let's link today's lecture with previous lectures that I've given on critical thinking, falsifiability, and so on. So my implicit goal in these series of lectures is to get you using powerful critical thinking tools to think for yourself. And that is so important to state in this particular lecture, which is on a topic that can be controversial. So my goals are to suggest tools of how to think here and not tell you what to think. If we could produce oppositional and independently minded students who actively seek disconfirming evidence and then let evidence guide them, then I would be very proud. And if our students go on to avoid emotionally appealing, unfalsifiable theories, ideologies in psychology, and instead are grounded in empirical cautiousness, especially when it comes to applying empirical findings to practice, I will be very proud. And please contact me in the future if you do go on to be a contrarian critical thinker who uses these ideas about critical thinking that we talked about. Let me remind you of the formula for gathering reliable knowledge in a fairly speedy way. First, the most useful theories are testable, and the best thinkers actively seek disconfirming evidence. That's a quicker way to accumulate knowledge than just focusing on looking for confirming evidence. Disconfirming evidence is much more powerful and much more informative. Now, this does not mean you believe the disconfirming evidence. It's more that you dig for it, you're motivated to find it. In fact, you may decide that your original theory survives after looking at the disconfirming evidence. Some of you might have been through this kind of thing when researching evidence about COVID-19. I indeed have actively sought disconfirming evidence on a number of claims that I've heard about, and in many instances I've retained the original hypothesis. Sometimes it is possible to be highly motivated and actively look for disconfirming evidence for a theory and find insufficient evidence for that alternative idea, and then to reject the idea. This might happen in other areas of science too. And an example of this might be looking at conspiracy theories about COVID-19, for example. One thing I should tell you is not to assume that people who reject conspiracy theories or alternative theories don't assume that they are sheep or non-oppositional or not good critical thinkers. They may have used independent thought to examine a lot of evidence and then come to the conclusion to reject the alternative hypothesis. So looking for disconfirming evidence can go either way. You can either disconfirm your hypothesis or you just keep your original hypothesis. Same with this content today on false memories and repressed memories. The more active you are and the more you dig into the evidence, the better. So long as you don't get caught in a unfalsifiable ideology and then no evidence helps you move away from that belief system. So I feel that in this area of false memories and repressed memories, I arrived at my conclusions about the topic after first subscribing to the idea of repressed memories theory until about 2006. So it was a period of time where I did subscribe to the idea, so I feel I have fully understood most iterations of the theory. And then, since then, I've actively searched for disconfirming evidence for all sorts of theories in this area. And in this particular case, this particular topic, I have rejected the proposed mechanisms behind the idea of repressed memories. So I've rejected Freud's ideas, for example. Now, you do not need to agree at all with me. So what I'm seeking more is that you form your own testable ideas and back up your position or your beliefs with empirical data that is published in the literature. So my position, or I might think of it as laying out my bias before we get into the topic, just in case you don't agree with me and you don't need to, is that trauma, of course, in part can be a cause of pathology, right? So that is something that is supported in the evidence. I also subscribe to the idea that trauma can be associated with dissociative symptoms, and we'll talk more about that later if you don't know what I'm talking about yet. But to lay out my ideas or biases, you might think of them, I'm not a subscriber to some aspects of the concepts of dissociative amnesia or dissociative identity disorder and the trauma models that come along with those diagnoses. And my bias more is towards a socio-cognitive theory of dissociative identity disorder and repressed memories and false memory explanations of the recall of repressed memories of which individuals were not even aware of it before. And I'm not a subscriber to repressed memory theory, but I don't want that to frame your thoughts in this or to constrain your thought process in this. This is just a conclusion that I've come to. And again, I hope you use your own independent thought in this very important topic. And I think if you do constrain yourself to using testable ideas, you're cautious and use empirical data to guide that cautiousness in applications, then I don't think you're going to do much damage. I think being cautious will protect the public from psychologists who practice. So let's start off the lecture by talking about some definitions before we talk about these concepts. Now, let's first off talk about what trauma is. So traditionally speaking, trauma, and let me just preface this by saying these are approximate definitions just so that you get a gist of what these things are. They're plain English discussions of what these topics are, so not exact definitions. But traditionally, trauma means an event that endangered your life, or you perceived it to endanger your life, or make a threat to your body, or the observation of somebody else being life being threatened. So that was a traditional kind of tight definition of trauma. Now, one of the criticisms of the definition of trauma is that it has broadened to include a whole lot of things that are not life-threatening, which makes it a less exact entity when you broaden the definition like that. Now, dissociation is a state of being where you feel disconnected from yourself, or you feel that depersonalized, like not human, and you feel that you have lost some memory, so there's gaps in your memory. So that is those are dissociative symptoms. Now, the definition of repressed memory approximately is the idea that you went through a trauma, you completely encapsulated that trauma in your memory so that you could not access it, and you were not even aware that it happened for a period of time after the trauma, and then maybe years and years later you unrepress the memory and you recall it in some detail. So that's the idea of repressed memories. Now, dissociative amnesia is a similar concept where trauma is usually taken to be the cause of a blockage of autobiographical or personal information. So it's a little bit broader than repressed memories because it can include losing your identity for a few days and then it coming back. But part of the definition of dissociative amnesia is quite similar to repressed memory, which is trauma helps store a memory such that is not accessible for a while. The idea is that the experience is stored successfully. There's a period in which it is encapsulated by trauma, and then at a later stage, because it is stored, it can be retrieved. And part of the definition is that it is not due to physiological reasons such as substance abuse and head injuries. It's a psychological cause. And approximately speaking, that psychological cause is usually thought of as being trauma. Now, dissociative identity disorder is a disorder that involves multiple personalities or parts or alters, and it used to be called multiple personality disorder. The connection to this topic is that it often involves, theoretically, often involves severe trauma that leads to dissociative amnesia of that trauma. And then if it's severe enough, the theory goes that it causes multiple personalities later. Okay, so these are just definitions. We'll talk about them more later. Now, the definition of memory distortion here is, there's a broad definition. So any change in memory over time or due to an effect. So, for example, when we talked about memory of emotion changes, those could be called memory distortions. And you could think of memory distortions as being an umbrella term that includes changes and includes false memories, where false memories are a subcategory where you can definitively say that the memory is false, right? So distortions in memory of emotions, you can't really call them false memories because you're not sure of what the truth is, right? But false memories are those where there's either a detail that is completely wrong or an entire event is recalled that did not actually happen. So let's first focus on repressed memories in the first part of the lecture, and then we'll link it to false memories later. So the question you might have is, how did Freud invent this idea of repressed memories? Well, he did get ideas from people who came before him, of course. Now, my idea here about how the progression of ideas went, and this is just one way of narrating what happened before, is that mesmerism started with Antoine Mesmer. It was not called hypnosis in that time, but mesmerism involved the idea that the use of touch and magnets and suggestion can help cure individuals. Of course, none of that did actually cure individuals, but you had people producing anecdotes of cure despite the therapies not being effective. Now, mesmerism evolved into hypnosis over a period of about 60 to 80 years. And in the middle of that development, the idea that during hypnosis you lose time completely, a period of time where you cannot remember what happened during hypnosis, developed. And it was like a forebear of the idea that you lose time during trauma. Now, it was not until Freud, in my opinion, that it was laid out in straightforward terms that you can be traumatized and then you can lose time during that trauma, and then you can recall that trauma later. So it's stored. The memories are stored, but blocked completely, and then you can recall them later. So this is just one narrative of how Freud got his ideas. And indeed, some of the ideas were before Freud as well. So Freud learned from the Nancy and Paris schools of hypnosis in France, of course. Now, the Nancy school, perhaps the most sensible of the two schools, involved a physician hypnotist called Hippolyte Bernheim. Now, he was skeptical enough to be one of the first to identify false memories as a consequence of hypnosis. In 1884, he first wrote about that. Nevertheless, he wasn't completely skeptical because he still talked about the use of suggestion in therapy in positive terms. Now, nowadays, we think of suggestion being a negative thing in therapy, but in those days, it was seen as less of a negative thing. So the idea that suggestion is okay perhaps explains Freud a little bit. And you also had the Paris School of Hypnosis that also consisted of a bunch of well-respected physicians who nevertheless got involved in researching hypnosis. So Jean-Martin Charcot, for example, came up with the ideas over time that hysteria may be caused by trauma and can lead to susceptibility to hypnosis. Now, this is getting really close to being a precedent of Freud's theory, if you think about it carefully. So trauma causes hysteria, and then you ask yourself, what is hysteria? Well, it's a culture-bound idea, right? So it's very specific to the time, and you might even consider it a sexist idea. But the idea was that it leads to susceptibility to hypnosis. And then you ask yourself, well, what does hypnosis involve? Well, it involves a loss of time, right? Or a loss of memory. And you can see the picture here on the top right of your screen. It's a famous painting of Charcot demonstrating hypnosis of a hysterical. patient. And you can see the kind of culture of the time and the beliefs created this kind of idea that you might consider to be a culture-bound, time-specific disorder, with the woman swooning and with hysterical symptoms. Now you notice that these theorists are assigning the problem of trauma as probable causes for hysteria without really establishing cause properly, using more careful research. Of course, it's difficult to do experimental research on trauma, but you can at least do carefully measured correlational research and longitudinal research, but they were not doing that at that time. They were just relying on anecdotes. And indeed, some of the syndromes involved in hysteria at that time did not survive the scrutiny of history and time. You don't see those same syndromes in today's society. So it just gives you an idea that sometimes these psychological diagnoses, because they come without objective tests, so there are different types of diagnosis than medical diagnosis, sometimes they can be bound with the times and with the fashions involved. And indeed, you can think of some of the psychological disorders we have that characterize the 1980s or the 1970s or the 1990s, and how as fashions change, you get spikes in certain types of diagnoses. And I think hysteria in the 1880s is no different. And thank goodness we have moved on from that. Now, also, Pierre Janet was also at the Paris School, and he learned from Charcot, and Freud learned from both of these people. So Pierre Janet came up with ideas of a dissociation. Now, on the last slide, I noted that dissociative symptoms are things like feeling depersonalized, feeling that you've lost memories or lost time, and feeling fragmented, that kind of thing. So his contribution was that he surmised that the primary defense against trauma is dissociation. So he used the terminology that Freud went on to use, such as there's different defenses against trauma or anxiety and so on. And Freud developed different defenses from there. So you have Charcot saying that trauma leads to susceptibility to hypnosis that might involve lost time. And then you have Janet saying that trauma leads to a kind of defragmentation that involves memory problems sometimes. So you can see where Freud got some ideas from. And then Breuer and Freud came along to write together in 1895, and then Freud's writings over the next few years also talked about repressed memories, and then he kind of changed his views later on in his career. But at this time, he put forward the idea that trauma can be a cause of repressed memories, and those repressed memories can be completely blocked, implying that the blockage was due to trauma. And then he also suggested that the use of a kind of catharsis therapy, of bringing back those memories with the full emotion, might be what's needed to cure these conditions. And all of these thinkers, all of these physicians here did report cures of patients that did not really stand the test of time. So you have to wonder whether this use of anecdotes is a good way to measure psychological treatments. I don't think it is. I think the better way to measure it is by doing clinical trials, using randomization into groups, and carefully measuring the variables before and after therapy. And also not using too much suggestion or social pressure with the participants too, because that can lead to them feeling pressure to report being cured. Now, Morton Prince came along in 1906, publishing a book which involved a long case history of one person who had developed multiple personalities. And this idea of multiple personality disorder is now named dissociative identity disorder. So he used the ideas of Pierre Janet, the idea that trauma leads to dissociation, and he took it one step forward, again using anecdotes and case studies, not using experimentation or careful measurement. So from his case studies, he would develop these ideas of multiple personalities, and his patients would report having multiple personalities. So it's not the most ideal way to gather information, but nevertheless, he is still cited today by psychologists who believe in dissociative identity disorder. So it's a source still used today. Now, I'm critical of the methodologies used by these individuals. There's some problems with unfalsifiable theories here, and also an over-reliance on anecdotes, case studies, and a lack of careful investigation into whether one variable is causing another variable, right? So lack of longitudinal studies using careful measurement, a lack of experimentation, which may be understandable because you cannot manipulate trauma, although you can investigate natural experiments. So at the same time, there was a split, like there is a split today, into branches of psychology. At that time, there was a branch of scientific psychology that was doing experiments into physiology, such as with Wilhelm Wundt, and making very slow progress into understanding the brain, but making some progress. And on the other hand, you have psychoanalysts and related branches that were coming up with grand theories very, very quickly. Now, hand in hand with that kind of skepticism that I've just put forward goes the Harrison Pope study in 2007, where he asked the question, is dissociative amnesia a culture-bound syndrome? And to investigate this, he invited people to find examples of repressed memories or dissociative amnesia cases before the 19th century, to ask the question of if this is a naturally occurring disorder, and it's not just bound by the strange culture of Freud and the hypnotists, it surely should have arisen in ancient literature, you know, in the same way that we have evidence of schizophrenia existing in ancient Greece or in ancient Rome. There should be some evidence that repressed memory cases were reported in ancient texts, or at least in texts before the hypnotist movement in the 19th century. And his conclusion was that there was a failure, there was an inability to find that evidence, concluding that there's no documented evidence that cases of repressed memory existed before the period of the hypnotism, development of hypnotism. Now, some people found repressed memory cases in fictional books in the 19th century, and maybe one or two in the 18th century as well, but no real cases. So it seems like the idea evolved over time, and it may, in fact, be a culture-bound syndrome. That was the argument made by Harrison Pope. So you have to ask yourself, if it is bound and dependent on the development of a culture, is it a real syndrome, or is a society playing a role with this new theory? So the theories that we just talked about did indeed survive, some of which to the present day in some psychologists, and they influence some of the case studies that we're going to talk about now. So we're going to use some case studies here to raise your interest even further in the topic, and by giving you vivid stories that you can then relate to the evidence that we're going to present later about false memories, and maybe false memory research will help explain some of these things. So the first case study is one of ritualistic satanic abuse, and I wrote just a tiny bit about this in an article, Patias and Younges, in 2015, in which I give some of the details of the quotes in a bit more detail. I'm going to cut some of the gory details out of this presentation. So the book was written, Michelle remembers, it was published in 1980, and it involves a famous case of repressed memory recall that may have influenced later trends in repressed memory recovery, especially in the realm of satanic abuse recovery. So in this book, Michelle Remembers, it chronicles a patient who, in 1973, this patient, Michelle, started therapy with Canadian psychiatrist Lawrence Pasder, and through hypnosis and other techniques, subsequently recovered severe satanic ritual abuse memories, and that recovery began in 1976 when Michelle was an adult. Now, Michelle recovered memories from a 2-year period in her childhood from between ages 5 and 7, in which she remembered being in a satanic cult with her mother. She had no memory of this before therapy, was not even aware of it before therapy. Her revelations included a series of sacrifices and cannibalistic rituals, and I'm going to leave out some of the quotes, but just to summarize them, she witnessed the murder of a baby, a ritualistic surgery on herself. She witnessed several dead bodies and the dismemberment of bodies, and remembered being kept captive in a cage as well, all of which there is no evidence ever found for. So there's not even any evidence that there was a cult or that she was in a cult. So if you're interested in finding the details of what was written in the book Michelle Remembers by Pasder and Smith, it's on pages 125 to 126, that little thing that I just summarized. Now, in another session, she remembers being taken into a room where several bodies were on stretchers, and then I cut out the details, but she remembered dismemberment. So as unlikely as these events are, and they raise questions, don't they, about whether repressed memories could lead to false memories, at least those we just discussed were at least physically possible. Nevertheless, Michelle goes on to describe memories of supernatural things that could not have happened, which gives even more evidence for the possibility that false memories could have been produced here. For example, she describes how Satan was summoned and eventually removed Michelle's scars, thus erasing any evidence of the alleged abuse. This is pure unfalsifiable theory, right? And also that her memories were erased of the events by Satan until the time was right. So obviously there's a mix of beliefs of repressed memories in with religious beliefs in this particular therapy. Michelle also describes a memory where Satan took her on a visit to hell and introduced his armies of the living dead, where she says that there's people in a terrible state. I'm not going to repeat the words, but it was presented on page 244 of the book. Disturbing things that I'm going to leave out. She also remembered a sacrifice of a girl by Satan himself. Now, given the supernatural, impossible aspects of some of these memories, they're likely false memories brought about by the hypnotic sessions. Even without supernatural aspects, several investigations found no corroboration of the events portrayed in the book. One possible alternative explanation is that the authors deliberately fabricated the stories, but I don't think that is actually true, because in interviews afterwards, they carried on believing in their stories. They carried on for decades afterwards without retraction. Now, whatever the evidentiary value for memory distortions in this evidence, it is entirely possible that this book influenced other satanic ritual abuse scares in the 1980s and 1990s, such as the McMartin Preschool case, which we're going to talk about on the next slide, the Faith Chapel Church case, and so on. And by extension contributed to the memory wars that came in the 1990s as well, which was a debate between those who did not believe in repressed memories and those who did. So a number of authors have also noted that there is very little substantial evidence for most, or if not all, cases of satanic ritual abuse in general, right? So, for example, Lannin in 1989, in a report for the FBI, concluded that there was a general lack of physical evidence for all allegations of ritualistic satanic cult activity. In other words, nobody has ever found evidence of this kind of satanic ritual abuse activity, despite us hearing about it in the news. Now let's move on to another vivid case study, the McMartin Preschool case. But before we get into the details, let's link this to the last page that we talked about. So in 1984, Lawrence Pasder, if you remember, he was one of the authors of Michelle Remembers from the last page. He acted as a consultant on this McMartin Preschool trial case. And Pasder also appeared on the first major news report on satanic ritual abuse, which was broadcast in 1985, and continued to give his point of view to the media for the next decade or so afterwards. So there is a connection. Perhaps the Michelle Remembers book had an effect. Now, the McMartin Preschool trial was a daycare sexual abuse case in the 1980s, prosecuted by the Los Angeles district attorneys. So members of the McMartin family had operated a preschool in Manhattan Beach in California, and they were charged with numerous acts of sexual abuse of children in their care. Accusations were made in 1983, and arrests and the pre-trial investigations ran from 1984 to 1987, and then the trial ran for 1987 to 1990. After 6 years of criminal trials, no convictions were obtained and all charges were dropped in 1990. When the trial ended in 1990, it had been the longest and most expensive criminal trial in American history. The case was part of the daycare sexual abuse hysteria of the 1980s and the moral panic over satanic ritual abuse in the 80s and 1990s. Now, several hundred children were interviewed by the Children's Institute International, which was a Los Angeles-based abuse therapy clinic. So here's a connection to clinical psychology right there. Now, the interviewing techniques used during investigations of these allegations were highly suggestive and invited children to pretend or speculate or to imagine about supposed events. By the spring of 1984, it was claimed from these interviews and this therapy that 360 children had been abused by this small daycare center. Now, some of the abuse that was alleged was bizarre. For example, some suggestions were that there were secret tunnels beneath the school, and several children started to remember this. And then after several excavations, they turned up absolutely no evidence of any underground tunnels or secret chambers. There were claims of children being flushed down toilets into secret rooms where they would be abused, and then they would be cleaned up and then presented back to their parents. Again, there was no evidence of these rooms or these connections, or any of this was ever found. In fact, there were some bizarre allegations, like, for example, the person who made the initial allegations that started off the whole tornado of copycat allegations made bizarre and impossible statements about Raymond Buckley, who was one of the accused, including that he could fly. Reminds you a little bit of Michelle Remembers, right? In 2005, after many years, one of the children who was an original accuser retracted their allegations of abuse by saying this. This is what they said, and in quote, "Never did anyone do anything to me, and I never saw them do anything. I said a lot of things that didn't happen. I lied. Anytime I would give them an answer that they didn't like, they would ask me again and encourage me to give them the answers they were looking for. I felt uncomfortable and a little ashamed that I was being dishonest. But at the same time, being the type of person I was, whatever my parents wanted me to do, I would do." Okay, so I won't insult your intelligence here, but as students, I just want you to use critical thinking yourself to figure out what may have been going on here. Perhaps some of the children were developing false memories. Maybe the adult who gave the initial accusation was suffering from false memories, and maybe some of them were developing not false memories, but deliberately lying just to give what the adults were asking for. Now, what I can say is this is just a surface treatment of McMartin Preschool case. I encourage you to look more deeply into it, and I and other psychologists have looked more deeply into it, and one of the take-home messages I can bring is that the deeper you look into it, the more certain you become that no abuse happened at all, not even minor abuse happened at all at this preschool. But that is my impression from all the evidence that came together in my own mind. Now on to another famous seminal case of repressed memories in therapy and resulting legal case. Let's talk about the Franklin case. In 1969, an 8-year-old girl, Susan Nason, disappeared from California. Her body was found 3 months later, a few miles from her home in Foster City, California. 20 years later, in 1989, Eileen Franklin, the daughter of George Franklin, reported that she had recovered repressed memories indicating that her father had murdered and raped the girl. Eileen provided numerous details that matched details of the crime scene, and on the basis of her memory, George Franklin was arrested and charged with murder. Now, Eileen claims to have observed her father raising a big rock and killing the girl, so she claims that she was present, but also claims that she was not even aware of her memories before the repressed memories came back. Now, Eileen testified at George Franklin's trial about her recovered memory. Much of the trial focused on the reliability of repressed memories, with each side presenting experts, with Elizabeth Loftus as a skeptic of repressed memories on one side and Leonore Ter as a proponent of the idea that repressed memories can be accurate. Now, the trial judge prevented the defense from introducing newspaper accounts that mentioned the fact that Eileen Franklin had that mentioned the facts that Eileen Franklin revealed in court. However, he did allow the omission of some circumstantial evidence, such as Eileen Franklin saying that when she visited her father in prison, he did not say anything about the crime, and then this was taken to be evidence that he must be guilty of the crime if he did not say anything to the accusations. Franklin's silence, said the prosecutor, in the face of the accusation was, and I quote, worth its weight in gold, and was an implied admission of guilt. In November 1990, the jury found Franklin guilty of Susan's murder, although the prosecution had not produced any physical evidence to connect him to the murder. The conviction rested totally on the repressed memory testimony of Eileen Franklin. Then, in January 1991, the judge sentenced Franklin to life imprisonment, the maximum sentence allowed. Later, a district court judge overturned the conviction in 1995, 4 years later, based on several trial errors, including the argument that a refusal to speak is an admission of guilt. And the trial judge's refusal to allow defense to argue that the details that Eileen provided about the case were based on newspaper articles, so she got the details from those, they argued. While the case was awaiting retrial, Eileen Franklin's sister came forward, Janice Franklin came forward, and revealed that Eileen Franklin's repressed memories were indeed recalled through hypnosis. Both of them had testified earlier at trial that Eileen had not been hypnotized. Because the state Supreme Court had ruled that the testimony based on memories recovered by hypnosis is unreliable, the evidence was thrown out, and Eileen could have been barred from taking the stand in a new trial. Furthermore, it gets curiouser and curiouser. Eileen Franklin's credibility was called into question even more because she later contended that she had also recalled repressed memories of 2 other murders committed by her father. The murders of 18-year-old Veronica Casisco and 17-year-old Paula Baxter. However, DNA tests conducted on the rape kits in 1995 revealed a male DNA profile that was not Franklin. So even in those early DNA analyses, Franklin was ruled out of those accusations. In July 1996, prosecutors announced that they would not retry Franklin, and he was released in 1996 after serving 5 years behind bars. Franklin later filed a federal lawsuit seeking compensation, but the lawsuit was dismissed. And then just recently, just 2 years ago in 2018, the DNA evidence that linked Rodney Lynn Halbauer to the murders, casting further doubt on the use of repressed memories in clinical trials and, of course, in psychotherapy too. And Halbauer was convicted of both murders and sentenced to life in prison. So again, I want you to use your critical thinking here to assess whether something may have been recalled in psychotherapy that may not have been true. So for the Ramona case, let's have an interview given by Elizabeth Loftus on a case that took place in the mid-1990s.
One of the saddest cases that I have come across in my years of working on these repressed memory cases is the case of the Ramona family. Gary Ramona was an executive with the Mondavi Winery. He was making $300,000 or $400,000 a year as a high-level executive. He lived in a beautiful house. He had a beautiful family, lived in a wonderful part of the world in Napa, California. And his whole world came crashing down when his daughter, Holly Ramona, went into therapy as a sophomore in college. And there she remembered, with the help of her therapist, that he'd raped her for more than a decade, that he'd forced her into, all kinds of sexual acts, including sex with the family dog, that she'd repressed this, she claimed, until the psychotherapy helped make the presence of these memories known to her. The whole family was destroyed. Gary Ramona lost his job, he lost his family, his life fell apart. And what happened in terms of the legal system is the daughter sued her father. Well, thousands of those cases were going on. But in an unusual move, Gary Ramona, the father, sued the therapist for planting false memories in the mind of his daughter. And he won a $500,000 verdict from a jury in Napa, California. And this whole story of the Ramona saga was told in a fabulous book by Moira Johnston called Spectral Evidence. Well, today, Gary still has lost his family. He's long since divorced. He still has lost his job. He did spend a little bit of time getting involved in the wine business, importing wines from Chile. He doesn't have his family back. And his daughter, Holly Ramona, now that is another story, because right about the time I was taking a new job at the University of California in Irvine, I got contacted by a woman who told me that, like many of the women who contact me, that she was so upset. Her daughter was estranged from the family. She was developing all these memories of abuse that the mother was positive never happened. And when I said to this mother, this sad new mother, I said, why don't you try to find out who is your daughter's therapist? Maybe we can find out it's one of the therapists who tends to be implicated in these cases. She went away and she came back and she said, I found out my daughter's therapist's name. It's Holly Ramona.
Now let's move on to another seminal and important case that involved psychotherapy that recovered repressed memories. And I also want to include this also to show the connection that this can sometimes have to multiple personality disorder, which is now called dissociative identity disorder. So Patricia Burgess in the mid-1980s developed postpartum depression. Now, one of the reasons why she developed so much depression is one of her babies was born paralyzed because of the trauma. The physical trauma of birth led to one arm of the baby boy being paralyzed, and she felt tremendous guilt over this and suffered from depression. She went to a therapist, Anne Marie Bowman, and instead of the therapist, understanding what the probable cause of the depression was, which is fairly obvious, she instead started to ask questions of Patricia. Have you ever heard of multiple personalities? So she led her down the track of maybe that she has multiple personalities, and that may be the cause of the depression. As a result of the therapist asking suggestive questions such as who am I talking to now and which personality are you now, etc., over weeks of therapy, Patricia developed 30 different personalities and answered the therapist as the therapist asked to hear from each personality. So it's a very suggestive type of therapy. And then Patricia was sent to Bennett Braun, and Dr. Bennett Braun took over. He was at Rush Hospital, and he helped her then start to uncover repressed memories of a satanic cult. Now, Bennett Braun had pre-existing ideas that satanic cults existed, and that they may be the cause of multiple personality disorder. So her therapy with Bennett Braun lasted 2 years or more. From approximately 86 to 88, she was hospitalized in the Rush hospital where Bennett Braun worked. Now, Bennett Braun used a cocktail of pharmaceuticals, lots of different ones, some of which were involved in anxiety, other ones were to relax her, and hypnosis. He used hypnosis to help her recall memories. So Bennett Braun did have this belief in repressed memories that went along with his beliefs of satanic cults. Now, the history of Bennett Braun was that years earlier, when he was training to be a doctor and a psychiatrist, he was actually asked to leave his residency as a doctor, but he did eventually receive his degree at the Rush Hospital after repeatedly failing, and even after he got his MD, he repeatedly failed to get board certification from the state. Eventually he did. Eventually he was able to find a job in this hospital. Now, the tragic thing about this is Patricia did indeed develop deep and disturbing memories of being in a satanic cult with murders, dismemberment of babies, and so on. But the disturbing thing is that she developed a belief system with Bennett Braun that her whole family had been involved in this cult, including her children. So, tragically, her children, who were approximately 5 and 3 years old at the time, were dragged into therapy sessions themselves at the hospital. They became resident at the hospital, and they also started to be go through the therapy techniques and develop false memories themselves of satanic rituals and eating babies. And at one point, with the help of Bennett Braun's suggestion, one of the boys remembered a body being cut open and guts spilling out. And it turned out that what the boy was recalling is probably a scene from Star Wars. This is something that Patricia said later on. And but it was believed to be a real thing by Bennett Braun. Now, not only, this is half comical and half tragic, not only did Bennett Braun believe in this, but he heard that Patricia told of her family getting involved in grinding up human flesh. Of course, this didn't happen, and because it didn't happen, I hope it's easier to bear. And as a result, he asked Patricia to bring in he took a hamburger from from Patricia's family's barbecue and brought it into the Rush Hospital, had it tested using the facilities at the Rush Hospital, and he came to the conclusion, incorrectly by the way, that the hamburger contained human flesh. So not only was he a bad scientist in the psychiatric sense, but also a bad biological scientist as well. I don't know how he came to this conclusion. Turned out to be false. Now, side by side all of this, eventually the insurance payments run out, and then these patients, such as Patricia, get separated from their doctor, thank goodness, because they get time to think about the craziness of what they've just been through in a psychotherapy like this. And indeed, Patricia learnt from various sources, such as the journal JAMA, that hypnosis should not be used because it could lead to false memories. The American Medical Association also wrote in the mid-80s that hypnosis is dangerous because it can lead to false memories. So she started to uncover information like this after her therapy and then started to develop doubts. So this helped Patricia realize that she had developed false memories, and then she retracted all of the unusual memories that she had recalled. She understood that the repressed memory therapy had brought them out. The cocktail of drugs with hypnosis had led her down this track, and she also retracted the idea that she had multiple personalities. She came to the conclusion that all these multiple personalities were false too. So she was coming to her senses now after being separated from the therapist for a time. So sometimes it's good that with crazy therapies like this, it's sometimes good that insurance runs out eventually. Now, Dr. Richard Offshee, who's a skeptic of repressed memories, a skeptic of multiple personalities, helped advise Patricia on a legal case that she brought, and he did not believe the diagnosis of multiple personality disorder or the stories of satanic abuse or anything like that. So he helped bring some sense to what had been going on. He had come across other cases like this. Now, the insurance policies had paid out a lot to different patients, to the doctors actually, for the treatment of different patients at Rush Hospital, to Bennett Braun and the hospital combined. And they received something like $3 million over a period of time from these multiple personality cases that ended up in hospitalization, which is very expensive in the United States, and which also led to high costs from the pharmaceuticals used and all the attention that the patients got. Now, what Patricia Burgess did is that she sued her therapist and the hospital for damages for creating false memories and for in satanic cult memories, and for creating for creating multiple personalities too. And then she also found out at that time that Bennett Braun faced 11 other similar allegations and lawsuits at the same time from individuals who had extremely similar stories with extremely similar memories to the ones that Patricia Burgess had recalled. Now, the similarities was not because these satanic cults existed. There's no evidence that they did exist. The similarities in the types of memories must have been coming from the therapist, because it's only these therapists who believe this that were producing this kind of fantastical memories that were so very similar between cases. Now, the hospital and Bennett Braun settled for a $10 million suit to settle the case without admitting any wrongdoing in 1997. And to learn more about this, you can go to YouTube. I've left the link here to watch a 40-minute long documentary that goes into all the details you need to come to your own conclusions. And I really, really hope you go and see that documentary, because it's not until you contemplate all the details that it becomes apparent to you, I hope, of how your certainty of the fact that these were false memories will increase if you get the details from this documentary. Now, these cases also happen in the UK.
Campaigners are calling for better regulation of the psychotherapy industry and a warning that some therapists are implanting false memories into the minds of vulnerable people. The family of one London nurse is raising awareness of the issue after she falsely accused them of murder. Sarah Harris reports.
She was a beautiful, happy child who grew up to achieve her dream of becoming a London nurse. But Carol's family say after she had therapy under hypnosis to help with headaches in her 20s, she falsely accused them of satanic abuse and murder before she sadly passed away. The allegations broke her father's heart.
Carol's early life had been wiped out completely, and she didn't remember it, and it had been replaced by these horrific memories which are totally false, every single one of them. And it grieves me to think that Carol wouldn't know how much we loved her, you know, at the end.
Carol's relatives are now leading a campaign to help dozens of other families who believe they've been falsely accused after their loved ones have undergone the same therapy.
There are far too many victims of sexual abuse, and they need to be supported. But when you're directing your resources at these fantasy cases, you're not supporting them, you're doing the opposite. And the difference between real victims is that they have been traumatised, but sadly for them, they can remember that trauma. They don't need a therapist to unblock their memories. They need to put them in a metaphorical drawer and deal with them on a day-to-day basis.
Dr. Julia Shaw is a memory expert at University College London. She's looked into many cases of false memory and says although the UK Council of Psychotherapists has already discredited this technique, more needs to be done.
There is need for more regulation. There's need for people to know and understand the risks associated with going into people's pasts and asking leading questions and trying to tease out memories of assumed events. So I think there's a definite need for more regulation in this field.
Dozens of families have already contacted the Felsteds from in and around London saying their loved one has fallen victim to the same sessions where so-called memories are recovered by hypnosis. In Carol's name, they say they won't rest until there is proper regulation, a chance to stop another family being painfully torn apart over flashbacks that never really happened at all. Sarah Harris, BBC London News.
And now into the details of the Carol Felsted case. Let's flesh out some of the details. So her initial problem was headaches when she was in her 20s. She went to a physician, as far as I recall, and the physician could not find a physical problem, so she was referred to a psychologist or hypnotherapist, because if they couldn't find a physical problem, they thought, well, maybe it is psychological. And she got taken into hypnotherapy sessions to help deal with this problem. And the psychiatric notes at the time, and this is me paraphrasing approximately what was said in the notes, were that she was abused from birth, but the patient cannot remember. Details will be produced in due course. Now think about this. There's only two people in the room. You have the psychiatrist and and Carol. Who knows whether she was abused from birth or not? If Carol cannot remember, it must be coming from the psychologist that she was abused from birth, presumably because she had symptoms of headaches, and they think that all symptoms must come from, or many symptoms come from, repressed memories. She was referred to the Tavistock clinic. I think she got therapy elsewhere as well, but this is one of the clinics she was referred to, where she began to work on recalling repressed memories over time. She came to remember her parents being leaders of a satanic cult, you know, where babies were murdered. Carol herself remembered having many babies and them being murdered. Of course, there's no evidence of this. Now, unfortunately, Carol passed away in 2005 after a period of a couple of decades in which she was distant from her family, and her family didn't know why she was distant. And they got a phone call and found out that her psychiatrist was listed as the next of kin. And it took them a long time to figure out what had been going on. And if you want to learn more about this case, there's a website set up by her family called Justice for Carol to get even more details. There's a wonderful talk from Kevin Felsted, who is Carol's brother, which I highly recommend. It's a fantastic talk. And there is a book that Kevin and his other brother Richard wrote called Justice for Carol, and the link is in the PowerPoint here, which I recommend. I haven't read it myself yet, but I ordered it today, so I'm going to read it soon. Now let's talk about some of the influential books that promoted the idea of repressed memory theory. Of course, early Freud was very important as a start, and there was other books in the decades by other authors. But let's fast forward until to the 1980s, and a book called The Courage to Heal was published in 1988 by Bass and Davis, who had no formal training or qualifications in psychiatry, psychology, or any form of treatment for mental illness. In fact, this book not only promoted the idea of repressed memories, but it also promoted the idea that vague symptom lists, the kind of symptoms that we all could identify with, are a sign of repressed early trauma, especially sexual trauma. So you had that suggestion in the book too. It was a very influential book that sold millions. It was a bestseller, and it resulted in being one of the leading causes of false allegations of child sexual abuse. At one point in time, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation found that the book was linked to about half of all the cases that they came across at that time, which involved false allegations of child sexual abuse that came from recovered repressed memories. There have been other influential books too, such as Judith Herman's Daughter, Father, Incest, published in 1981, and her book Trauma and Recovery, published in 1992. Again, inside of those works is the idea of dissociative amnesia or repressed memories, as well as other ideas too that I would be less critical of. Betrayal Trauma in 1996 was published by Jennifer Fried. That in itself is an interesting story. Jennifer Fried split from her parents in terms of belief and physically split from them too, became estranged from them. Her parents went on to be founding members of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, and she went on to write books and articles on the topic of betrayal trauma, which includes some aspects of repressed memories, repressed memory theory, dissociative amnesia, as well as remembered trauma too. Now, there have been newer books that I've noticed on Amazon as I looked at them today, and I don't want to name them or criticize them until I've investigated more closely. Such as books written in 2018, 2019 on DID, dissociative identity disorder, and dissociative amnesia and trauma. But I'll refrain from naming them until I've found more time to investigate whether they actually are promoting the ideas that I think they're promoting. And of course, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, published in 2013, has a section on dissociative amnesia. In some of the types of dissociative amnesia, in other words, the subsections, the definition of them, such as selective dissociative amnesia, matches up quite closely to the definition of repressed memories. So the idea of repressed memories is an ongoing saga that is not going away right now. It did not go away with the close of the 1990s and the memory wars in the 1990s. It's still ongoing. Now let's continue to try and answer this question of whether repressed memory beliefs and repressed memory therapies are still a concern in the modern time, in the last 5 years and today? Well, in 2014, we published a paper that investigated individuals' beliefs about repressed memories. So in this particular question, we gave them the statement that repressed memories can be retrieved in therapy accurately, and we also give them a definition of repressed memories in a couple of places in the questionnaire. And then we asked them to disagree, to answer on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And these are some of the results by group of the percentage who agreed to some degree with the statement repressed memories can be retrieved in therapy accurately. Now I'll just point out a couple of these results. Notice that undergraduates at the University of California, where they did indeed have a professor who was a skeptic, Elizabeth Loftus, still 64% showed some level of agreement with the idea that repressed memories can be retrieved in therapy accurately. Now, those high levels were also found in the general public in the United States and United Kingdom. Now, by contrast, when it came to clinical psychologists who were researchers, only 16% of the researchers in universities in the United States agreed with the idea that repressed memories can be retrieved in therapy accurately. Now, contrast to the clinical psychology practitioners who see patients and don't usually do research, 43% of them agreed to some degree that repressed memories can be retrieved accurately in therapy. So you can see what we called a scientist-practitioner gap in beliefs about repressed memories there. Now, the overall findings here, to simplify them, are that researchers at universities are skeptical of repressed memories, and everybody else is not so skeptical about repressed memories. And this article answered the question of, are there enough people in the general public who believe in repressed memories who might create some kind of demand for repressed memory therapy? The answer is yes. More than 50% have some belief in it. And then you ask the question: are there some practitioners who believe in repressed memories that could supply that demand of repressed memory therapy? And the answer is yes. Not all of them. Not even 50% of regular practitioners. But if you can notice on the alternative therapists, the percentages are higher. So a larger majority of alternative therapists believe in the idea of repressed memories. Now, this is in the decade of 2010s, right? So fairly recently. So the previous slide's results that quite a lot of the public believe in repressed memories raise the question of whether repressed memory recovery was still going on in the United States recently. So we asked a large sample of the public, during the course of therapy, did you come to remember being abused as a child when you had no previous memory of such abuse? We deliberately left out the terminology repressed memories and instead replaced it with something like a definition of repressed memories. And as expected, we found that in the 1990 to 1994 time period, there was indeed a peak. That was when all the sociological forces came together and repressed memory therapy became more popular. And out of those who said that they started any type of therapy in the 1990s, a full 18% of them reported remembering in therapy being abused when they had no previous memory of such abuse. Now, the question was, does that continue on to the present day? And surprisingly, we think that we found that it does indeed. There was a narrative that the problem went away. I don't think that narrative is correct. So let's take, for example, the time frame 2015 to 2017. Out of those people who reported they started therapy in that time frame, a full 9% of them reported remembering in therapy being abused as a child when they had no previous memory of such abuse. So this is just some evidence that perhaps there is a problem in society with the recall of repressed memories. It doesn't seem to make it into legal cases as often as it used to. It doesn't seem to make news stories or the evening news like it did in the 1990s, but maybe it's a small and problem there's no light being shone on it. So this table 2 here is from Petius and Pendergrast, and it is the same data broken down by therapy type, with the therapies with the most highest prevalence of repressed memories at the top of the list, and then at the lowest prevalence at the bottom of the list. So for example, the attachment therapies at the top had high percentages of individuals who was involved in that therapy recalling something akin to repressed memories. Then you have emotional freedom techniques, also high percentages. Acceptance and commitment therapy, perhaps surprisingly, has high percentages. Internal family systems, 23%. Exposure therapy, 22%. Hypnosis, perhaps no surprise there, 21%. We know the problematic history of hypnosis. Presumably some hypnotic sessions do involve in recovery of memories. Obviously, most do not. You have survivors group with 21%, that type of therapy. And then you have some surprises here where the prevalence is not zero. You have behavioral therapy surprisingly producing some percentages here of memory recovery, repressed memory recovery. And going down to cognitive behavioral therapy, there's also some prevalence within those. So clearly these names are not corresponding to exact practice. These therapists who are calling themselves cognitive behavioral therapy seem to be taking an eclectic approach. That's what may be happening here. And perhaps a surprise at the bottom, psychodynamic therapy that has its roots in Sigmund Freud's theories has a very low prevalence of repressed memories here. So that is in keeping with the idea that psychodynamic theory has changed a lot and left, and the majority of which has left repressed memories behind. So what is going on here? Why is it that there were some repressed memory skeptics of the 1990s that got the impression that maybe they had won the memory wars, the argument about repressed memories in the 1990s? And why is it that those who believed in repressed memories also believe that they may have won the argument over repressed memories? Well, this might help explain in part what has been going on. In part, I think what has happened is the word repressed memories went out of fashion during the memory wars of the 1990s for good reason. A lot of the good arguments put forward by skeptics of repressed memories were very effective. They made it into mainstream news and so on. What may have happened instead is the terminology may have changed from repressed memories to dissociative amnesia, and that new terminology may have been embedded into the diagnostic and statistical manual and into literature as well, into peer-reviewed literature as well. So to explain how this may have happened and how they may be equivalent in meaning, let's examine the definitions of dissociative amnesia on the one hand and repressed memory on the other hand. And this table was one that I created for the article by Henry Ottgar and colleagues. So you can find it in that reading. That is one of your readings. So let's first take dissociative amnesia, the definition, right out of the very important book, the DSM. So it is described as an inability to recall autobiographical information, usually of a traumatic or stressful nature that is inconsistent with ordinary forgetting. So it's not just ordinary forgetting. And that it is successfully stored. Now, this is a key element of it, that it is actually stored. And then it involves a period of time where there is an inability to recall. So even if you consciously want to recall it, you cannot recall it. Also, importantly, it is not caused by a substance or neurological condition, such as a drug, alcohol, or a bang to the head. And finally, it is always potentially reversible because the memory has been successfully stored. Now, why is that definition any different from the definition for repressed memories? So this is this definition here is from Loftus, who is a skeptic of repressed memories. So she defines it as something happens that is so shocking, right? So perhaps the cause is trauma, is being implied there, that the mind grabs hold of the memory and pushes it underground into some inaccessible corner of the unconscious where it sleeps for years or even decades, or even forever, isolated from the rest of mental life. Then one day it may rise up and emerge into consciousness. So we're talking approximately about the same phenomenon where trauma is the usual cause. Trauma is the entity that encapsulates the memory, and that the memory is stored, and it is unconscious, or there's an inability to recall for some time, and then it can be recalled successfully later. So let's speculate for a few minutes on how repression theory arose in the first place. So what was it in Freud's thinking that arose to add in the idea of repressed memories, and what has it been in theorists in the century that followed that seemed to recur, where they held a theory similar to Freud, and then they added this repressed memory aspect as an ad hoc addition. So the central theory to understand how this probably happened is the theory that Freud held, which was that childhood trauma or abuse, whichever way you want to call it, is the major cause of psychopathology, or what they used to call adult neurosis. Now, this is not such a bad theory if it's left like this, where it's falsifiable and scientific, without any invisible entities. Childhood trauma is measurable if you're careful, and adult pathology is also measurable, and these are non-invisible entities. So this is a falsifiable and scientific start. It's a reasonable start. Now, what happens if this theory is a political theory to you that you want to protect? How could you possibly make it unfalsifiable so that it is never refuted? Well, let's look at this theory with ad hoc additions that make it unfalsifiable. So childhood trauma causes adult neurosis. It's a reasonable hypothesis. There may be a small relationship between the two, or a large one. It's an open question. But what happens if you add things to this theory, such as the idea that vague symptom lists equate to adult neurosis? That makes it very much easy to always find a connection between childhood trauma and adult neurosis, just by making adult neurosis so broad so that everybody could find themselves in vague symptom lists. So in other words, if somebody does have trauma and they feel that they don't have adult neurosis, they will still nevertheless be able to find some of these vague symptom lists, such as the vague symptom lists listed in the book I mentioned before, The Courage to Heal. This preserves the theory quite strongly. So without this addition, there would be exceptions to the theory, right? So there'd be people who had been traumatized, but they had no adult neurosis. Adding this vagueness of symptoms helps block that disconfirming evidence. Similarly, and more importantly, repressed trauma is an invisible type of trauma that helps preserve this theory. It's an ad hoc addition that makes the theory impossible to prove wrong. Because if you have somebody come in to your practice with severe neurosis or psychopathology, depression, headaches, whatever you want to call it, and then they report no childhood trauma, that would formally have disconfirmed your theory, right? However, if you introduce the invisible entity of repressed trauma, you can state that these individuals must have repressed trauma, and your theory that trauma is a cause of neurosis is still maintained. So by adding these vague symptom lists and repressed trauma are ad hoc additions that makes the theory now unfalsifiable and unscientific. And because in history, unfalsifiable theories have survived for thousands of years, I am concerned that this particular concoction of ad hoc additions to this theory will also preserve this belief system for a long time in the future too. So how is the memory wars debate proceeding today? What are the modern arguments made by people who think that trauma can be dissociated and repressed memories stored? Well, first of all, you have what they now call the trauma dissociation model. They don't call it repressed memories anymore. And the theory goes something like this. Trauma leads to dissociative symptoms, and they go to great lengths at, showing that there is a correlation between reported trauma and dissociative symptoms. I think that relationship is quite low, especially when you measure it outside of trauma clinics. But nevertheless, I think there is a small correlation. And then the argument goes one step further to something that I may not agree with, that in extreme trauma cases, those dissociative symptoms can involve full-blown dissociative amnesia, where the individual is not aware of sometimes very, very severe abuse memories. And the general takeaway from these theorists who believe in this is that unrepressed memories should be believed. And sometimes these theorists act as expert witnesses in court when repressed memories are put forward in court to do with a crime. And some of these writers in the modern day are clinical psychologists like Bethany Brand and Constance Dallenberg. So this is one side of the coin of the modern terminology of those who would have you believe that trauma can be completely blocked. On the other side of the coin are the skeptics of repressed memories who subscribe to the socio-cognitive model, or the false memory explanation of repressed memories. So this is sometimes called the fantasy model by critics of the socio-cognitive model, less so by proponents of the model. So one argument goes in this model is that dissociative identity disorder can involve role-playing and social pressures, and part of the model is that perhaps these identities are not actually multiple personalities. The therapists may be using iatrogenic techniques to produce multiple personalities. Another part of the model is a concern that false memories occur when patients and therapists will believe in dissociative amnesia and the trauma dissociation model. And those false memories, of course, can end up in court sometimes. They can end up splitting up families. So this is a major concern. And also, these theories point out a jump in the logic of trauma dissociation theory. That is, they argue that, yes, dissociative symptoms may occur after trauma, such as feeling depersonalized, but those dissociative symptoms and those scales that measure dissociation do not prove anything about full dissociative amnesia, which involves extraordinary forgetting and then extraordinary remembering. So researchers who subscribe to this socio-cognitive model include Stephen Lynn, Harold Merkelbach, Henry Otgar, Scott Lilienfeld, Elizabeth Loftus, Nicholas Spanos when he was alive. They subscribed to this kind of model. So which of these theories can help explain and reduce these terrible tales of suffering that we've talked about today? Now, on the one hand, yes, trauma can cause psychopathology or be a partial cause of psychopathology. There are exceptions to this, of course, but this is an important part of keeping your eye on the ball in what we have to accept in order to prevent suffering. That is, reducing trauma, prosecuting abuse in order to stop suffering, genuine suffering from genuine trauma, preventing other ways of people get traumatized as well. But in addition to this, the theory of false memories can also offer an important explanation and a theory with potential to prevent such suffering as the terrible cases that we heard about today too. So both theories are not completely antagonistic, and then both are important to take into account to reduce suffering in humans. So after having mentioned false memory research several times in our discussion about repressed memories, now let's focus solely on false memory research for a few slides. So first of all, Frederick Bartlett wrote a book called Remembering in 1932 based on a series of experiments that he did in memory research. Now he used The War of the Ghost, which is a Native American story, as stimuli, and he's found that his British participants tended to misremember this story according to the schemas that they have of their own cultural expectations. So they left out parts of the story that did not fit with their British culture and their expectations. They couldn't remember those parts, and they tended to change the story slightly to fit in with their understanding of how their world works. For example, they would replace part of the story that was going hunting for seals with fishing, which is more common in British society than hunting. Now, his conclusion from his research and his theories is that memory is more reconstructive than it is reproductive. So he was one of the pioneers of this idea of constructive memory. Now let's fast forward to research in the 1970s on the misinformation effect, or what became known as the misinformation effect, and this involves developing false memories of details in experiments. So Loftus and Palmer's 1974 paper involved stimuli of seeing a video of a car crash, a fairly low-speed car crash, and what they found was the amount of broken glass that was remembered later by participants was increased if they were in the experimental group in which that received suggestive words such as, "What do you remember when the cars smashed into each other?" where smashed is a suggestive, misleading word. Other conditions included the word hit instead of the word smashed, and they found different amounts of broken glass being reported. And later on, the same researcher, Loftus and colleagues in 1978, did one of the first misinformation effect experiments, where you have a stimulus, where you see a slideshow of a car accident. And in a slideshow, you might see a stop sign, but later on, you may be given misinformation that it was a yield sign instead. So the way the misinformation effect works is you have a stimulus, such as a slideshow, or you see a crime or see a video, and then a period of time passes by, and that period of time is important to allow the memory to fade a little bit. And then later you receive some kind of misinformation. And of course the parallel here is to receiving misinformation from a police officer who is interviewing a suspect in a criminal case, or perhaps misinformation from a therapist in a therapy case, right? And then importantly, there's another gap of time between misinformation and test, and then you have a test where you ask people, what do you remember from this, from the scene? And what happens here, if you do give misinformation, such as saying that it was a yield sign rather than a stop sign, is that you have false details being remembered due to the misinformation. Now, this is called the misinformation effect, and the misinformation effect, more precisely, is the finding that the experimental groups who receive misinformation tend to remember more false details, statistically significantly higher than control groups do. Now, what about false memories of entire events? We talked about false memories of single details, but what about this? So the memory wars of the 1990s raised the question of whether whole events could be remembered, and in a parallel to whole events being remembered in some psychotherapies. Now, Loftus and Prickrell did a study called the Lost in the Mall study, in which they managed to use suggestion, multiple suggestion, over time to implant entire memories of being lost in the mall in childhood, where the participant reported being upset, and the memory involved a friendly elderly person coming to help them. Now, this included suggestion that the participant's family had suggested it. Now, what they found was 25% of participants reported remembering being lost in the mall, which likely didn't happen because the parents who were also involved in the experiments had informed the researcher beforehand what had and hadn't happened. Now, other research since then has found similar kind of things. False memories for entire events, such as dog attacks in childhood, such as spilling punch at a wedding, and such as committing a crime. All of these have been implanted in experiments since then. Now, these are the closest parallels to false memories of trauma that you find in therapy. So it's the closest parallel that is ethical to do in experiments. You can't, of course, implant memories of real severe trauma. This is the limits of the type of memories you can implant in experiments. Now, suggestion is not the only way that false memories have been produced in research. Now, memory researchers started to notice that guided imagery was being used in therapies, as well as suggestion, and they were resulting in probable false memories, and these cases ended up in court cases that involved repressed memories. So, guided by this, Gary and colleagues did a study on imagination inflation, where they used something similar to guided imagery, where participants were asked to imagine a scene and then to build up details within that scene and to experience it vividly within their minds. And they found that these imaginings helped inflate the confidence that these childhood events actually happened from one point to the next. In a similar study, Goff and Rodiger found that using imagination for events that participants had either done in the lab or not done in the lab, they found that repeated imaginings led to false memories of actually doing some of the events. So they found similar false memories of doing events that they had only imagined, doing events in the lab that they had not in fact done. So there's converging evidence on imagination inflation having the ability to inflate improbable memories and increase the confidence in them. And this effect can be explained well with the idea of source monitoring errors. So imagining creates a similar encoding in the brain as a real memory, and the source of the memory is tagged as an imagined event. However, later, as memory fades, that tag that says that this source of information is from imagination may be lost over time, and eventually you may just have the memory of the imagining without the tag of it being an imagination. So you can lose the source of information and misremember an imagining as a real memory. Also, a consistent finding in some of the repressed memory cases that ended up in legal court was hypnosis. Hypnosis was implied in a lot of cases, and there's been some studies on this to see if hypnosis does increase false memories, and there is some evidence of that. For example, Lawrence and Perry in 1983, in an article published in Science Journal, conducted a study testing the ability of people to induce memory recall through hypnosis. So a false memory of having been awakened by some loud noise during a night in the previous week was suggested to 27 highly hypnotizable subjects during hypnosis. And afterwards, 13 of those 27, so about half, stated that they had indeed remembered those loud noises waking them up in the week before, which were actually false memories. In another study involving hypnosis, Manelstein and Lin found that participants reported early memories through hypnosis more so than they did prior to hypnosis. In fact, those who were undergoing hypnosis, 2/3 of them reported memories, early memories, autobiographical memories from before the age of 2. Now that is much before the cutoff for infantile amnesia. Infantile amnesia is a natural occurring amnesia that we all encounter for the first few years of our lives. We tend to forget them because of the maturation of the brain. So this is again indicative of memory distortions of some kind. So the question is, are all humans susceptible to these memory distortions and reconstructive memory? Now, there have been several studies that have found that there's no actual memory trait among students or the public. So in other words, among people who are psychologically well adjusted. Ost and colleagues found this. We found it in a recent study, and I write about it in a commentary here as well. So these findings can be separated out into two types. So first of all, if one individual is susceptible to false memories, they fall for a false memory task, that does not really predict that they will fall for another different type of false memory task. So it doesn't seem that there's just one set of individuals who are especially susceptible that they keep on falling for it. At least not within psychologically normal individuals. It may be different if you test individuals with schizophrenia, for example, of course. And another part of this is within these fairly psychologically normal samples, none of their individual differences, such as personality traits, seems to predict the susceptibility to false memories very strongly. Now, some articles have found that measures such as fantasy proneness may be a small correlate of false memory susceptibility, as well as the tendency towards dissociation. But these, I have found, are very small effects, so they're close to being null effects in some findings. Also, along this theme of everybody being susceptible, we found that people with very strong memory, those with superior autobiographical memory, were also susceptible to some of those memory distortion memory tasks that we put them through. This was a study done in 2013. So the conclusion from this is that within people with ordinary cognition, there's kind of a baseline susceptibility to false memories where nobody is exempt. Now, of course, it's possible that those with mental illness may be even more susceptible to false memories, but I think it's fairly safe to conclude that nobody is immune to memory distortions. Now, there is some convergence from other areas of basic cognitive psychology that can kind of converge in on the same types of messages that cognition is constructed, the same kind of findings that you get from false memory research. It kind of converges. So, for example, there's a basic constructive nature of even perception, and these kind of findings have come forward in perception research. For example, sight is deconstructed in the first stage of vision, and then it's reconstructive in a constructive nature later on with the help of attention. The basic models of memory that came out of hundreds of articles on empirical articles on memory indicate that there's a great deal of loss of detail, a great deal of loss of memory at each stage of the memory system. So sensory memory, a lot of sensory memory is lost when it's taken through into short-term memory. And then a tremendous amount of short-term memory is lost in the transfer to long-term memory. And even within long-term memory, there is decay. So this converges with the findings of false memory research. Another finding in cognitive psychology, of course, is that none of these cognitive processes involves recording the scene or the stimuli at all. It's much more constructive than that. Another finding in basic psychology is that epinephrine tends to increase the strength of a memory, although that memory is still vulnerable to decay, of course. So excitation or terror is likely to increase your recall of traumatic events rather than block it out. Consolidation theory, it goes hand in hand with that. So excitatory hormones tend to help the consolidation of memory, not hinder the consolidation. And there are null findings on the area of the brain or the neurotransmitters that might be connected to repressed memories. In other words, we have not found any area of the brain that is involved in repressed memories, or we haven't found a neurotransmitter that represses memories, anything like that. And of course, we have found no evidence of any kind of perfect storage, the kind of storage that would be necessary to explain some of these repressed memory cases where there was no memory at all for a period of years, and then almost perfect vivid memory being brought back in psychotherapy. And there's also no evidence that such reliable storage can be completely blocked out by an entity. So there is so much more to talk about when it comes to false memory research, but let's just conclude because we're up to 2 hours now. So what we did today is talk about some case studies that illustrate the potential harm of believing in repressed memories and then digging for repressed memories. The harm being false memories, which can lead to estrangement of families and legal cases and so on. You can really destroy people's lives. We talked about the trauma dissociation model held by some individuals who believe in repressed memories, or at least in dissociative amnesia. And we talked about the sociocognitive model, or the false memory model that explains the phenomena we see in repressed memory cases in a different way. We talked about the contrast between those who believe in repressed memories or dissociative amnesia and those skeptics who do not believe there's any credible evidence that repressed memories can be accurate, especially if the participant was not aware of them before therapy. And the message to you is to think for yourself on these matters. It's a controversial subject. Using a motivated digging for disconfirming evidence. So put the effort into looking for disconfirming evidence, and then let the evidence guide your temporary position. And as the evidence changes, your position should change over time. Indeed, if you are a good scientist, a good thinker, you will find your beliefs changing every few years as new evidence comes in. So I hope you have enjoyed this deep dive into the strange world of repressed memories and false memories. And here are the references of most of the sources I referenced today. Thank you very much, and goodbye.